Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to PlayView. The name's gurvmlk and I'll be your host as we dive into the world of Pokemon Shield for the Nintendo Switch. And today, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently than usual. I wanted to get a video out for this game just as sort of a little celebration for the fact that we're moving on to the next Pokemon generation. We've got this new game to play. I'm super hyped to get into it, and I just wanted to have a video in celebration of this game. This isn't going to be an actual Let's Play. I don't want my personal experience with this game to be affected in any way. I want to be able to enjoy the game in my own way, at my own pace. I don't want to just... I feel like if I were doing a Let's Play, I would have all the editing and all the constant talking and having to try to be entertaining or keep interesting conversation going would affect how I enjoy the game on my first run, and I don't want that. Not to mention I would have to play it based on when I can record, and I feel like I'm going to be wanting to play the game much more frequently than that. So we're not doing a Let's Play. In fact, this commentary is pre-recorded. The game isn't actually out yet as of recording this audio, but I want to have it ready for when I need to make the video. Basically, what's happening here is I'm going to be playing the game for a while just to have the footage going for people who want to see the very beginning of the game, as I'm just playing it on my own time. And during that, I'm just going to be here talking about various Pokemon things. That's a broad term, but Pokemon things associated with myself, like memories about certain things. I hate using that word. And opinions about certain things, like favorite whatevers. This is just gonna be, I guess you could say it's gonna be more like a podcast. Just me talking about Pokemon and personal experiences and thoughts about it. I have a list, so it's sort of scripted, but not really. I have vague ideas of what I want to discuss, because I was thinking, what do I want to do as a video that I can release alongside the release of the game? And so I got the idea to do sort of a, not a countdown, but go through a list of 8 topics to discuss, because it's the 8th generation, so why not have 8 topics? And if anybody wants to add to these topics with their own stories or experiences or thoughts and opinions in the comments, then feel free to do so. I'll be looking forward to any interaction we can have there as we share our Pokemon stories with each other. Alright, so let's hopefully kick this thing off strong with a countdown to favorite Pokemon. This isn't going to be a countdown of like my top 5 favorite Pokemon or my top 10 favorite Pokemon, because that's something that can frequently change, and it's really, really hard to narrow it down like that when there are so many Pokemon that I just adore. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the timeline of my favorite Pokemon, going through every single Pokemon in chronological order that at one point was my number 1 favorite. And that journey starts us with Caterpie. My very first introduction to Pokemon was the anime, which I imagine is the case for a lot of people outside Japan. And I remember I was at the computer, my brother was watching the show. It was the 2nd episode, and I had never heard of it. I had no idea what it was, but I was just playing a game on the computer or maybe surfing the internet or whatever. And he was right there in the same room watching the show, and I kept glancing over curiously, kind of half watching the show, half doing what I was doing. And when it was over, I asked him about it. And then the following day, I decided to watch it with him. And then I've pretty much followed the show ever since, except for a time period when I stopped. So the very first episode of the show that I actively watched and really paid attention to was episode 3, where Ash catches Caterpie, and I fell in love with Caterpie. I didn't really have a very strong opinion about any of the other Pokemon that appeared in that episode, like Pikachu or Pidgeotto or Ekans and Koffing. I just really loved Caterpie. Caterpie actually stuck as my favorite bug Pokemon all the way up until Generation 5 when they introduced Galvantula, which is interesting. So, yeah, I didn't really know very many of the Pokemon. All I knew about Pokemon was what I caught a glance of the second episode, and then watching the third episode. I didn't even know who all the characters were, honestly. I remember, this is going off on a bit of a tangent, but that's alright considering the nature of this video. I actually remember there was the episode where, I think the very first time I heard of Gary was the sign where Ash, Misty, and Brock walk up to this sign leading, I believe, to Cerulean City, and Gary vandalized the sign by writing on it with a marker saying Gary was here, Ash is a loser. And I'm pretty sure that was the very first time I had ever heard of Gary, and then I think the very next episode, I remember during the intro, I asked my brother, is that brown-haired guy in the opening supposed to be Gary? And he said yes. Before then, I believe the only mention of Gary at all was in the first episode, which I didn't even know the show existed yet. Getting back on topic, Caterpie was my very first favorite Pokemon. After that was Charmander. Kind of the same deal. I was learning the Pokemon as I was going. I hadn't played the games yet. I don't even remember if the games were out quite yet in the States. They might have been, but I don't remember exactly how long the games took to release, because I'm pretty sure the anime came first here. So my next favorite was Charmander. I saw the episode, obviously, where Ash got his Charmander, and just really liked this Pokemon. I thought it was adorable. I really thought it was a cool concept that the flame on its tail dictated its life energy. And also, in like video games in general, particularly like RPGs that have elemental magic and such, my favorite element in those types of settings has always been fire. So that's another thing that kind of fascinated me towards Charmander, was that it was a fire type Pokemon, and probably the very first one I ever saw. And the fact that fire was so prominent in it with its tail flame and the flames it could shoot out of its mouth, I just fell in love with it immediately, and it was one of my favorite Pokemon for a very long time. My next favorite Pokemon, also still in Generation 1 and also introduced to me in the anime, was Golem, which, for those of you who don't know, it appeared in an episode involving a biker gang on the Cycle Road, which was a bridge that was still under construction in the anime, but the bike path was opened up, so but it was being overrun by a gang of people on bicycles, because that's what biker gangs are. They ride bicycles. So Golem became my next favorite Pokemon, although with that it was a little bit differently, because, I mean, I was like a 12-year-old boy at the time, so things being powerful and badass was just the greatest thing. I didn't care about cutesy stuff or crap like that. Give me might and give me muscles and give me just rah! And Golem kind of was that to me. It was just this bulky, powerful thing, and I just thought it was awesome how its body was just made of all these rocks and it looked like it could just crush you. So Golem became my favorite Pokemon, and was for quite a while. It was up from that point until Generation 2, so Golem was my first favorite Pokemon that was my favorite for a particularly extensive period of time, which is interesting because I don't really find Golem all that fascinating anymore. It's not really very interesting. Yeah, it's still kind of badass, but it doesn't really do it for me anymore. It just seems way too generic and uninteresting for me. Now we move on to Generation 2 with my first Gen 2 favorite Pokemon, which was Steelix. Another Pokemon that I don't really have particularly strong feelings for or against nowadays. But back then, kind of like what I was just saying about Golem, how I thought it was badass, Steelix just took this badassness and cranked it up to 11. Which is interesting because I didn't really care all that much about Onix. but whatever. So Steelix became my favorite Pokemon for a while, and I remember using it in the games, and it was just probably one of my better Pokemon. I can't really remember. It's been way too long. The only thing I really remember about Gold and Silver was the time I spent trying to defeat Red at the end without grinding, because I didn't want to grind, because I wanted to be able to do it without grinding. So it was just a process of fighting him over and over and over and over and over again for days, perfecting the strategy that I needed to defeat him. Like, it came down specifically to every single turn doing a very specific action and hoping that he did a very specific action, and just trial and erroring my way through this fight to the point where I finally managed to beat him with my highest level Pokemon only being level 55 or 56 or something like that. It was an ordeal, let me tell ya. But I remember Steelix being in my party because it was my favorite Pokemon at the time. I don't really remember what else was in my party, honestly, though, aside from obviously my starter, which was Typhlosion. Speaking of which, I can go off on a little bit of an extra tangent on this same subject. I just said that my starter was Typhlosion in Generation 2, so I just could go through all of the starters, my favorite starters from each generation. It's mostly been fire, sometimes grass. I'm planning on picking Scorbunny for my starter in Sword and Shield. I don't know if that's happened yet in the footage, but that's what I'm planning on picking for my starter, just based on their first forms. But I'm kind of hoping that my favorite will be the water type. I don't even remember what its name is off the top of my head. But I'm really hoping that that will be my favorite, because not once has the water type starter been my favorite, and every generation I'm thinking I really want an awesome water type to be so I can finally have the water type be my favorite. But going down the list before we get back to the main subject, my favorite in Generation 1 is Charizard. Favorite in Generation 2 is Typhlosion. Favorite in Generation 3 is Blaziken. Gen 4 finally mixed it up a bit because I don't like monkeys. They're just not something I've ever really particularly liked or been interested in. So the crown for my favorite starter in Generation 4 was Torterra. And then 5 was Superior. 6 was Delphox. And then 7 is Decidueye. Had to think a little bit for some of those, because just going through the list, I'm trying to think which ones were which generation again. Now, even though my favorite has never been a water type, that's based solely on the final evolutions. As far as first forms go, there have been 1 or 2 instances where my favorite was the water type. The one that stands out the most is Piplup. I definitely prefer Piplup over Turtwig and Chimchar, but there's never been a final evolution where I liked the water type the most, and I'm hoping that will change with Sword and Shield, but it's way too soon for me to know if that will be the case yet, especially because I've been actively avoiding information on the internet about the game so I can experience them as blindly as possible. And I've heard that by this point of recording this, I've heard that the starters and their evolutions have been leaked, but I'm not looking anywhere into that, which is also why I'm not looking online right now to double check what the water starter's name was, as easy as that would be for anybody who is wondering, well, why don't you just Google it real quick and find out what it was? That's why. Even if I were to just type in that name, other stuff I don't want to see could show up, or I could trigger some sort of targeting advertising or some nonsense that would show me stuff I don't want to see yet. Next on the countdown of my favorite Pokemon, this weird journey we're going on, the next one, and the most iconic to me, if you were to ask anybody I know who I've talked with Pokemon about extensively, this is the one they would probably say is my favorite, because it was my favorite for so many years, and is the one that I just absolutely adored. I even have plushies of it and such, and a decoration on my wall, and that Pokemon is Umbreon. The interesting thing about Umbreon is I didn't really like it at first. It was probably my least favorite evolution of the whole bunch that existed at the time. I didn't really know anything about it, and I just thought its design was really boring and uninteresting. And as much as I try to judge Pokemon based on their abilities, their Pokédex entries, their physiology, what they actually are and what they actually do, obviously you can't do that right away. So the first judgment of a Pokemon is almost always based solely on its appearances and then goes from there. And with Umbreon, I was just very unimpressed. I thought it was really stupid looking. And even to this day, I still kind of sort of do think that. But my opinion of it is just so strong that I kind of ignore that nowadays, because it's still definitely number 2 or 3 on my list of just all Pokemon in general. I remember being at a friend's house one night, or evening rather, and we watched the episode on TV, and it's weird because I don't even think this was my first time seeing the episode. I think it was just a rerun that we decided to watch to pass the time. And it was the episode where Gary's Umbreon first makes its debut. And something about it just fascinated me. His Umbreon was just so badass and cool, and its abilities, like how it could light up its rings to make lights. That was stupid. And then later on, reading up more stuff about it in the Pokédex, like how it can release the toxic sweat, but that came later. But I just saw this episode and became obsessed. I just remember heading home from my friend's house a while later, and I just could not get Umbreon out of my head. I just became weirdly obsessed with it. And then I just kind of came to terms with the fact that Umbreon's my favorite Pokemon, not Steelix. And it was just a weird feeling because it came out of nowhere, because up until that moment, I really didn't care about Umbreon at all. But then it became probably the most iconic Pokemon to me. So yeah, I was gonna say I loved Umbreon for years, but I still do. It's still my favorite evolution, with number 2 being Vaporeon, and number 3 probably being Glaceon. But yeah, Umbreon was undisputed favorite Pokemon up until Generation 5. So all through the rest of Generation 2, all through Generation 3, all through Generation 4, no question, all those years, Umbreon was my favorite Pokemon. I even remember it was the one and only Pokemon whose Pokédex number and whose weight and height I memorized. Every other Pokemon, I didn't really care about that information, but with Umbreon, those are details that I wanted to know, because it was the very first time where I was so fascinated by Pokemon that I wanted to have that information committed to memory. And even Generation 5, it wasn't really replaced, but it sort of was, because I became kind of conflicted. And this is where I have to throw an honorable mention into this list, because I feel like I do still like Umbreon more, but I gotta give an honorable mention to Serperior, because it was the very first time where, kind of even to this day, I still find myself sometimes sitting down and asking myself, who do I like more, Umbreon or Serperior? And if I'm just asked, like, on the fly, though, I'll say Umbreon, just because it means more to me to have that be there. And it was kind of getting to the point, though, where I was starting to sometimes ask myself, is Umbreon really my favorite Pokemon? Or is it only my favorite because I'm so used to it being my favorite that I refuse to let anything else top it? But then it happened. It was finally defeated in the number 1 spot, indisputably, by what is currently my favorite Pokemon from Generation 6, being Delphox. Delphox is indisputably now my favorite Pokemon, although Umbreon is still definitely more iconic to myself. But I still feel like a lot of people, even if you ask to this day who my favorite Pokemon is, they would probably say Umbreon, either because they forgot and are just so used to it being Umbreon that Delphox being #1 slipped their mind, or maybe because it hasn't come up, because frankly, Pokemon isn't a topic that really comes up in conversation with my friends and such quite as frequently as it once did, especially considering I've definitely stayed into the franchise much more deeply than most of the people I know. It's my third favorite video game franchise, and I get obsessed. And whenever a new Pokemon game comes out, I pretty much become obsessed with it from start to finish. And that includes the side games like Pokemon Ranger, Mystery Dungeon, and all that stuff as well. Speaking of which, I would love for them to make a new Pokemon Ranger game. I've wanted them to do it ever since the Wii, because I thought it would be a really awesome transition to have that kind of gameplay with the motion controls to really capture the feel of being a ranger. So getting back on topic of Delphox, it's my favorite Pokemon primarily for 3 reasons, and it's just a perfect culmination of everything. For starters, it's a fox, which is my favorite animal in real life, so that's a huge plus right there. Secondly, it's a fire type, which, as I said before, is my favorite element, which would also be applicable to Ninetales. And Ninetales and Charizard kind of go back and forth. Well, before Delphox, those two kind of went back and forth for my favorite fire type, just depending on my immediate mood. But then there's the one last thing about Delphox that just completely sells it for me, and it's the combination of these 3 things coming together as one that really just made me fall in love with it. And that's that it's designed after a wizard. It has that wizard look, that wizard style, that archetype. Even its mystic fire ability is very reminiscent of magic, both from the name and the fact that it has like that sort of mystical, magical quality to its added effect. Because it's nothing like what you would expect of fire, but it's being caused by fire. I mean, it even uses its stick as a magic wand instead of shooting fire out of its mouth like other Pokemon would. So just all that, its design being very wizard-like, I just love it. And I feel like Braixen is a lot more popular among people, but I definitely prefer Delphox. Braixen feels like an immature apprentice. Like it kind of starts getting that thing going for it, but it's just real childish, real... It doesn't have the grace or sophistication of a matured wizard. And that's what I love about Delphox, is it's much more composed, whereas Braixen just comes off as really childish, almost like it's, well, like I said, it's more like an apprentice thinking it can just do whatever. It's really hyper. I feel like it's cuter, I'll give Braixen that. It's cuter than Delphox, but it lacks the sophistication that I really feel drives the whole wizard motif with Delphox home. Riding the topic of favorite Pokemon, we can finally get to the second thing on my list. That last topic dragged on a bit longer than I expected. Hopefully some of these other ones will go a bit more quickly, so this video doesn't drag on forever. So that said, let's just hurry on to the next topic, which is kind of going off of what we were just talking about, favorite Pokemon. And that's Pokemon I like to use in PvP battles. I enjoy doing PvP battles in the core series games. I'm not a pro by any means. I don't compete in tournaments or anything like that, but I feel like I'm decent whenever I play battles online using those restrictive rules that they present players with for random matchmaking. I do decently. I don't do ranked battles just because I'm not a fan of having to jump through hoops just to be able to play a game. And you have to do all that registration stuff on a website or some crap. I don't want to have to deal with any of that kind of nonsense just to play a game online. So I don't bother with any of that. So I just do unranked random matches every now and then. And I do decently. I win some, I lose some. My biggest weakness is my Pokemon aren't very coordinated with each other. I usually just create Pokemon based on either ones I like and try and come up with strategies for them, or I'll come up with a strategy that I think will be fun and then try and come up with a Pokemon that can perform that strategy effectively. Now, I could go on for a really long time about all the different Pokemon I use and the strategies they use, but to keep this topic a little bit more concise, I'm going to stick only with Pokemon that I mentioned in the previous topic, And those ones are Umbreon, Serperior, and Delphox. And just kind of go over what I do with them real quickly, just because, I mean, some of these topics are a little bit of a stretch because I wanted to come up specifically with 8 of them, as well as having some variety between what they are. So some of these are going to be a little bit of a stretch. It may not be quite as interesting as some of the others. That said, let's go from bottom to top as far as the order we went in the previous topic, starting with Umbreon. Umbreon was the Pokemon that really introduced me to enjoying using deeper tactics in these games, which is another reason why it's an iconic Pokemon to me. When I was a kid, I would just hit hard, hit fast. I thought tactical moves were pretty much just a waste of time because I had it in my head that if you could beat the story mode in the games, you were a pro. Because the Elite Four are supposed to be the best, blah, blah, blah. And it just didn't really register to me that the games were stupidly easy on purpose, and that being able to get through those games doesn't in any way reflect one's ability to be able to battle other actual people. And Umbreon was the very first Pokemon that really introduced me to using more proper tactics, because it occurred to me of how weak it is. It can't really do much damage when it hits, but if it's used correctly, it can really be effective. And I remember my very first strategy with Umbreon. It had the Synchronize ability because I didn't have access to the hidden ability. I don't even know if the hidden ability was a thing yet, or when hidden abilities became a thing. So I would use Synchronize with it. I always use Leftovers for its hold item for the most part. Sometimes I would switch it up with a Llama Berry because I used Rest for healing. But basically the strategy for its moves were pretty consistent. I would use Toxic, Confuse Ray, Double Team, and then for a while I used Moonlight, but then I replaced that with Rest because, yeah, it takes a couple turns. But with Confuse Ray and Double Team debilitating my opponent's attacks, those couple turns were usually inconsequential, and they would heal not only my hit points, but also status ailments as well. And that's why I would sometimes use the Lum Barrier so I could use Rest, fall asleep, wake back up instantly, and then by the time I needed to use Rest again, my evasion would be much more fortified thanks to Double Team. In Sun and Moon, though, my current Umbreon is much different because of new moves that have come out since then. I stuck with that old strategy for a long time, but I more recently changed it up. It now has its hidden ability Inner Focus because Synchronize isn't really that useful with Umbreon, I feel like. It still holds the Leftovers, though. That hasn't changed, so it can have more lasting power combined with its defenses. But its moveset is completely different. I now use Moonlight for Restoration, Yawn for slowing down my opponent's attacks, Foul Play for hitting them instead of trying to wait out poison damage, which some Pokemon are flat out immune to anyway, and also Swagger in place of Confuse Ray to complement Foul Play's effects of being stronger the stronger my opponent is instead of depending on my own attack power, making Umbreon a really powerful Pokemon both offensively and defensively. Again, I'm not a pro. I'm sure these aren't really professional tactics. I also don't look up tactics online. I've seen websites that like list strategies and stuff, but no, I don't do any of that. I just try and come up with my own strategies, and I'm not so concerned about whether a strategy is good or bad. All I care about is that it's a strategy I have fun using, and whether or not it's effective just comes later. Next, we'll talk about Serperior. I may be the only person I've ever seen who uses Overgrow instead of Contrary for Serperior's ability, and that's not because of a lack of access. I believe I do have a hidden ability Serperior that I could breed to get a PvP one with that ability, but I don't want it. I prefer Overgrow with Serperior, again, because I prefer fun tactics over effective tactics. And just spamming the hell out of Leaf Storm while getting stronger is boring. That's not a fun way to play the game to me, so I don't, regardless of how effective it might be. And I've gone up against Contrary Serperiors before. They are indeed painful to fight. But that's just not what's important to me when it comes to these battles. So instead, I have it with Overgrow for its ability, and I have it built around to complement that. For starters, its hold item is a Miracle Seed to strengthen its grass-type moves. And for its moves, I give it Grassy Terrain, Giga Drain, Calm Mind, and Glare. Starting obviously with Glare to paralyze the opponent, I'll then use Grassy Terrain to start getting some healing going, and Calm Mind to boost the power of my defenses and the power of my Giga Drain. And then from there, I just hold out. Grassy Terrain keeps me going a little bit longer. I keep getting stronger with Calm Mind, especially if my opponent is debilitated enough from Glare that they can't act for a turn or two, and basically just comes down to holding out until my hit points get low enough that I can hit my opponent with Giga Drain, getting a power boost from Stab, getting a power boost from Overgrow, from Miracle Seed, from Grassy Terrain, from the Calm Minds I used, and just slam them with an overwhelming Giga Drain that usually one-shots my opponent, and then gets almost all my hit points back in the process. And then I just repeat it, using Glare again, refreshing Grassy Terrain when necessary, and then strengthening up more with Calm Mind when I'm given the chance to make the next Giga Drain even more devastating. That's probably one of my more effective tactics of all the Pokemon I have. Again, it's not perfect, it requires some build-up, but it works. It gets the job done a lot of the time, at least with the opponents I've generally faced. Next, let's move on to Delphox, which I use Blaze for its ability because I feel like Delphox's hidden ability is really stupid. And for its hold item, I have a Wide Lens because I use some inaccurate moves and depend on them quite a bit. And for its moveset, I've got Fire Blast, Psychic, Will-O-Wisp, and Calm Mind. Will-O-Wisp to inflict burn and also increase my physical resistance more or less by weakening the enemy. Calm Mind for what it's for, and then Fire Blast and Psychic to use for hitting based on which will be most effective against the opponent. This is probably my least effective of all these three Pokemon because it kind of relies on stall tactics, which Delphox isn't particularly good at. And I think I've read before that that's kind of one of Delphox's problems. It has movesets that are built around stall tactics and things like that, but its stats are not built around that, making it kind of a contradiction of what it can do and what it tries to want to do. But it works. I usually am able to defeat at least one of my opponent's Pokemon, or at least weaken them enough to where my next Pokemon can finish them off. So my Delphox really comes down to sort of a one-to-one thing. Like, it defeats one, then it gets defeated, or it gets defeated and then my next one immediately comes in and finishes the job. It's almost unheard of for it to have the strength to really be able to defeat more than one of my opponents, unless I wind up with the type advantage. Because usually what happens is if I feel like my opponent is more of a special attacker, I'll use Calm Mind to strengthen up a bit before attacking, or if they're a physical attacker, I'll use Will-O-Wisp to burn them, and then usually thanks to the power boost, I'll survive the next attack, and then hit them, either taking them out in one shot if I'm able to, or weakening them before being finished off. And that's all there really is to say about that. Just a real simple topic. I was trying to think of things to include on this list and discussing my favorite Pokemon and how a lot of them are ones I use in PvP battles on a fairly regular basis. I decided to just throw this in as one of the topics we're going to discuss. I needed 8 of them for the 8 generations, and a few of them were easy to come up with. Just right away, I knew what I wanted to talk about, and then the last, 2 or 3 were just kind of like, I need something. And that's why we just talked about this. If anybody wants to share their strategies or what they think of these strategies in the comments, feel free to do so. And from that, we'll just move on to the next topic, shall we? For topic number 3, we're delving into slightly different territory because this is more specifically related to the anime. I wanted to talk about some stuff involving that as well, and one of the ideas I came up with was to just go over what some of my favorite movies are. I was originally going to make it into a top 5 list, because I feel like there's a solid number of movies for that. But aside from my number 1 favorite movie, it's kind of hard to decide definitive choices because it can really just depend on my mood. So I just thought I'd share some of the movies that I frequent. Ones where if I feel like just sitting down and watching a full-length Pokemon movie for a while eating dinner or unwinding after work or whatever, these are the ones that I commonly find myself revisiting, and some of them are kind of interesting, all things considered. So I thought I'd just go over that, just share some of my opinions about this particular topic. Because I don't really want to put numbers to any of these, though, I'm just going to go in order of release, from oldest to newest. I just think that will be the simplest way to just get through this nice and neat, and not commit myself to any particular favorites being above the rest. And while I've liked most of the Pokemon movies, there's very few that I just look at and I'm just like, this is stupid. These are just the ones that I put leagues above the rest. 9 times out of 10, if I'm going to sit down and watch a Pokemon movie, it's almost always going to be one of these choices unless I'm just in a very specific mood for a very specific film, especially if it's one I haven't watched very many times yet. So I might be more drawn to seeing something that I'm less familiar with. First on this little list of ours is Pokemon Heroes. And it's kind of hard to peg down exactly what I like about this movie that makes it so enjoyable over the rest. There's just something about the atmosphere, something about the characters. I really like the interactions with Latios and Latias. And the relationship with Ash and Latias, while really weird, is also one of the more interesting things about the movie, I feel like, because it's so different from anything else. Aside from that weird-ass crush that Chikorita has on Ash that I'm sure many people are very thankful was never explored further, for obvious reasons. So yeah, Pokemon Heroes, it has a great intro sequence, and one that just really drives home how hilariously great of a character Totodile is, and also immediately sort of introduces you to the legendary Pokemon. And I also like how Ash doesn't win. I like how they have Misty win instead. One of the things I like most about the Pokemon anime is that Ash doesn't always come out on top. Most animes and TV shows and such in general aren't very interesting because you always know the hero's going to win, but in Pokemon there's no consequences for the hero losing in most situations, so I like how it creates that sense of tension that you don't know who's going to win. But that's going off on another tangent that I don't have a spot for in this list, so I'm just going to stop myself right there before this topic also drags on way too long, especially because I could go on about that for a long time and it would go off into other topics, and that's a tangent I just don't want to get into because it would drag on for way too long, I feel like, and would just get way too off topic. So this movie, the villains are interesting. I like how they're members of Team Rocket, but are actually competent. It shows that Team Rocket actually has members that matter, unlike Jesse and James that are just a complete waste of space and should have been fired ages ago. I'm not really a fan of the whole comic relief villain dynamic. I feel like a villain should be threatening, which is why the only time I ever really liked Team Rocket, aside from James being one of my favorite characters in the show, but I'm just talking like Team Rocket as Team Rocket, the only time I really liked them was in Generation 5 because it felt like what they were doing actually mattered. I keep going off on these tangents because I just don't feel like there's a whole lot I can really say to add to this, especially because I'm not a movie buff, so it's hard for me to really formulate my thoughts into words as to what I like about a movie. So we're just going to move on to the next film on this list, which is Lucario and the Mystery of Mew. Again, it is kind of a tricky one. I like Lucario's character. I like how he kind of develops as the story goes on. The action sequences are great. I like the incorporation of how the Reggies were involved in the storyline, and just the progression of the whole story from Mew showing up and whisking away Pikachu and Meowth to Ash awakening Lucario, and then those guys all going off to save Pikachu, and then this disaster striking. Then all the stuff with the past and how it comes full circle and how the truths of the past are revealed. It's just an enjoyable ride. I like the story, the characters that are unique to it. It's a fun setting. It has interesting threats that aren't just a human trying to take over the world or a legendary Pokemon going berserk. The threats to the heroes are much more unique and interesting in this film, I feel like, compared to most that follow a much more repetitive formula. And it all comes together into a climax that is both touching and incredible, and is probably one of the best endings of any of the films as well, except for the fact that because the movies like to completely be ignored by the series, I feel like it's all boils down to wasted potential, because I feel like some of the stuff that happens at the end of that movie, particularly with Ash and some of the potential he shows, I feel like that's something that they could have delved more deeply into throughout the episodes to kind of become a thing, a minor thing, but the whole aura thing could have been applied to Ash in some way where he could have found a way to utilize it to some capacity at some point, especially during one or two specific episodes of the anime where aura was a theme, but they just completely ignore it because it was a movie. And it's not like the movies aren't canon and people could suggest that they're not canon, but except for the fact that there was specifically a story arc in the anime where the second movie was referenced. So obviously the movies are canon. I also don't understand the whole ideas of the movies not being canon, because it's not like they wouldn't be able to fit. There's so much downtime sometimes just between episodes of the show where these events could have occurred. But I feel like people just try to write these things off as non-canon just because the show doesn't reference them. But I still feel like they fit just as well as anything else in the show, so why can't these be canon if any given episode is? That's just as useless and just as never referenced again. I mean, yeah, Ash sees Pokemon in the movies that he then acts like he's never seen before in the show, but he's also done that with other Pokemon in the show that he's seen in the show just because it's a new season, so they want to reintroduce this stuff and pretend like the old stuff never happened. So if they can do that within the show itself, why can't the movies be the same way? And all that said, I feel like they could have and should have at some point explored Ash's aura powers a little bit. Not too extensively, and they wouldn't have really needed to make it a big thing, but I feel like something should have been done with that, especially during one or two specific episodes. That's details I can't really recall off the top of my head, so I'm not going to give any specific shout-outs to those at this time. I just feel like it's something that was more ignored than it should have been, but also shouldn't have become a really big and major thing either. The next movie on this list is Kyurem vs. the Sword of Justice. And this is an interesting entry because when I first watched it, I didn't really care for it all that much. I liked it, I thought it was good, it was enjoyable, I liked some of the characters. The threat of Kyurem was fun, and watching the movie made Keldeo one of my favorite legendary Pokemon, but aside from that, I just didn't really find it very interesting. It was just, I don't know, it just felt really generic and predictable. And the whole thing about Keldeo trying to overcome his fear is something that I feel like is just a tired concept in storytelling for shows for kids in general, or just stories in general. So there just wasn't anything about it that particularly stood out. But the more I watched it, the more it grew on me. It was one of those cases where I saw it the first time, wasn't very impressed, watched it a second time when it came out on DVD, liked it a little bit more, and then the more I watched it, the more I felt myself compelled to return to it over and over again, and then it eventually just became one of my favorite Pokemon films through that. One thing I was hoping the movie would do, though, that it didn't, is I was hoping for Kyurem to be a little bit more menacing. Yes, he was menacing and dangerous and powerful in the movie, but considering the reputation they give him in the games, in the video games, they were talking about how he's this deadly, destructive, ravenous beast who goes around eating people and eating Pokemon, and I was hoping something like that would be in the movie to make him feel more threatening than the average villain in Pokemon who just wants to beat you up and then not kill you. Because it's a kid's show, so we can't have somebody trying to kill you. They're just gonna hurt you a little bit and crush your pride. And then nothing. I feel like with the reputation they built up in the video games with Kyurem, they should have done more with that. Like, I wouldn't expect him to actually kill anybody, but he could have at least threatened Keldeo. Yeah, his objective isn't to kill him when you get to the end and find out everything that's going on. But just the threat of it being there would have been appreciated and was something that was missing from the movie, given the reputation they gave Kyurem in the games by that point. So it was something I was kind of expecting. I was expecting him to be more deadly, more menacing, more evil, and then he wasn't, not even for show, for the sake of portraying himself as a more threatening villain to push Keldeo into doing what he needed to. And that's one of my favorite things about the Volcanion movie. That's not a movie on this list, but one of my favorite things about that movie is that the villain actually tries to kill the heroes. There's a point where he has his, was it Tyranitar, I feel like? Use Hyper Beam or something. I think it was Tyranitar. It might have been Gengar. I don't remember exactly which of his Mega Evolved Pokemon he had do it or if it was multiples. But he literally, once he's gotten what he needs from the heroes, he literally tries to kill them. And that was one of my favorite points in the movie, because they had a villain that was actually a villain who was willing to do what he needed to get the job done, rather than trying to be a child-friendly villain for no other sake than the target audience, completely ignoring what's in his best interests within his world and caring instead about the fourth wall and entertaining the people beyond it within a reasonable range. The last entry on this list is coincidentally my favorite Pokemon movie, and that's the I Choose You movie from a couple years ago. My God, that's never have my expectations for a movie been so low and then been so blown out of the water. I've definitely had the reverse be true with plenty of movies, but never has it been like that where I just go into a movie thinking it's gonna suck, thinking it's gonna be something completely uninteresting. All I knew about the movie going in was that it was a retelling of Ash's early days and how he met Pikachu, so I was literally just expecting it. I think I also knew Marshadow was in the movie in advance, so I was just expecting it to be a theatrical version of the first 2 or 3 episodes of the anime, with Marshadow shoehorned into it for something involving the plot. And I believed that so strongly to the point where when I was watching it on TV, I had to pause it and check the time, because I had recorded it, because I was at work when it aired on TV, so I had to record it and watch it later. And they get to the point where Ash and Pikachu see Ho-Oh fly overhead, and I was just like, I expected that to be like the halfway point of the movie. And so I'm like, how long have I was shocked, and I had to see how long have I been watching this movie, so I paused it, and it was only the 10-minute mark. And I was just like, holy shit, is this actually going to be a good movie? Is this going to be more than I expected? So I continued watching, and from there I was just blown away at how good this was. I loved what they did with Ash and how you got to kind of see how he used to be again but in a different setting, because Ash was much more selfish back in the day. He was a completely different person in the early days than he is now, and it was interesting seeing him brought back to his roots, more or less, and then watching his character develop in a way that was much more well written than anything in the anime series. So, because I thought this movie was just I didn't even think it was gonna be like an alternate timeline thing. I thought it was just gonna be a way to introduce new audiences to the beginning of Ash's quest by releasing a movie with some slight tweaks. But then oh my god, I was just so blown away by this movie, and I couldn't believe how much better it was than I expected, that by the end I just wanted to watch it again. I didn't watch it immediately afterwards because I didn't want to wear myself out on it. And then it got me so excited when I then learned that the next movie was going to be taking place in this same alternate timeline. And that got me really, it got my hopes really high, because it got me thinking I would love it if from here on they no longer tied the movies into the anime at all. They just continued on this alternate timeline, stuck to that, completely let the anime series and the movie series be their own stories. And while The Power of Us wasn't a bad movie, it's probably still one of my favorite Pokemon movies as well. It was a huge disappointment because my expectations were so high. And it wasn't even so much because of the quality of the movie, so much as it did nothing to advance Ash's journey. I was really hoping that it would be meaningful in some way. Like Ash would catch new Pokemon, or maybe get a new gym badge or two, or learn some sort of new lesson that he would take on to the next film. But now not only are they doing the dumbest thing conceivable by remaking the very first movie with worse animation, but that movie, it just didn't add anything, and that just left me really disappointed. And now the fact that they're doing this remake kind of thrashes my hopes of what I would love to see, which is just continuing this alternate timeline through the movies instead of going back to the original thing of whatever. So I'm really hoping with the first Generation 8 movie, they'll get back on track with that alternate timeline and actually advance it. Show that Ash's journey has progressed. Maybe have him use some new Pokemon that he caught between the movies, or have him catch something during the movie, or maybe be like, he's gotten this many badges now, or maybe even incorporate a gym battle into the movie. Like they could even have him battle for his 8th gym badge with Giovanni and have that in some way associated with taking on Team Rocket. I just think that they could do so much with an alternate timeline and have it have such better writing than the actual series. And I'd really love to see them explore that potential rather than just throw it in the trash because the writers of Pokemon are idiots. Topic number 4, and perhaps the weirdest thing we're going to be discussing today: LARPing. As a kid and a teenager and even a young adult for a brief time, my friends and I used to like to get together and play outside. We wouldn't play like sports and such, usually. Sometimes we would maybe go to the park and play baseball. And one time a friend, my brother and I created our own game, which we called Unga Bunga Ball. I don't know why that name came up, but it was just a weird game involving like a dodgeball and playing on the street, kicking the ball, and then you'd have to like run down the street as far as you could before somebody caught it to score points. It was an interesting game we played on a number of occasions when we were very young. But usually we would go out and play imaginary games, which at the time we just called RPGs or RPG games when we were very young and didn't really grasp the idea that the G in RPG is game already. Usually, we would just do generic games in fantasy or sci-fi settings where we would be wizards and warriors and dragons and all this stuff. And the scenarios would always have a GM. 9 times out of 10, it was me who would play the roles of the NPCs, the villains, come up with the story and all that stuff. Whenever there was a fight sequence, they would be the bad guys that the heroes had to take on. We never used physical weapons. We always just used our imagination for our magic and swords and all that stuff. We also never really had any rules that were set in stone. We didn't have stats, none of that kind of stuff. There wasn't anything really deep about what we did. We would just come up with our characters. Each player would describe their character, describe their abilities, and then we would bring those characters together on some sort of quest that usually started with some kind of tournament. That was kind of my thing, where I would usually start a scenario with a tournament that the heroes would compete in, and then there would be something that would happen as a result of the tournament, maybe because of why the tournament was happening. Maybe it would result in them being chosen as heroes, or there's some sort of more wicked plot behind the tournament. It was just a thing that I used on a regular basis, and I even tended to use the tournament idea for starting things when doing tabletop RPGs. I think it was just something that I felt was really easy to do. It was a really simple setup to bring all the characters together who wouldn't know each other beforehand, and also was just a nice, neat way to kind of get the adventure going, because they would all join this tournament to fight, and then stuff would just happen from the tournament and then go from there. Sometimes, though, we also played outside games based on particular franchises like Dragon Ball Z or Power Rangers or Mega Man. Various things where we would use familiar characters and just apply our own stories to them, or create our own characters within the worlds that these stories exist. I remember one Dragon Ball Z scenario, actually, where one friend was playing a Saiyan and the other was playing a human, and there was a point where they were using original characters, but it took place in the same realm as the anime, so a lot of the same characters were around. And there's a particular point where Vegeta gave the Saiyan a power boost and transformed him into a Super Saiyan. Mind you, this was before Super Saiyans had actually been revealed in the States, so all we had to go off of were the fact that they existed and pictures online. We didn't actually know yet how Super Saiyan transformations worked. We just thought once the Saiyan became powerful enough, they became a Super Saiyan. So Vegeta turned him into a Super Saiyan by giving him a power boost so he could help defeat this bad guy. And then I remember the human character asking for a power boost as well, and Vegeta had given all the energy he could just about, so he gave the human a little bit of energy, raised his power level by 1, and then my friend was like, I am now a superhuman. Basically, he just made up superhuman as a thing just so he wouldn't feel completely obsolete compared to the Super Saiyan. Back to the topic of Pokemon, we also regularly did Pokemon scenarios where we would be the trainers. We never played as the Pokemon themselves. Basically, how we would do it is we would be the trainers, and when it came to a battle, we would just throw out our Pokemon and use our imagination for what the Pokemon were doing while calling out commands like attacks, or telling them to dodge attacks, or maybe doing more elaborate things. Basically, just we were the trainers and we used our imagination to envision what the Pokemon were doing. I wanted to discuss some of the more interesting stories and events that occurred during some of these scenarios. I have a few things I wanted to talk about here. I thought I would bring this up as one of the topics because it's a bit more different and it'll mix things up a little bit instead of just talking about specifically the video games or the anime or particular favorite countdown things. This is something to add a little bit more variety to this discussion. First off, I want to talk about the Caterpie tree. As I said moments ago, I was almost always the GM in these scenarios. Sometimes my brother would do it, sometimes a friend would do it, but almost always I was the one responsible for running the worlds that we did these games in. And a recurring theme for the Pokemon scenarios was the Caterpie tree, and it got to a point where my friends were very familiar with it after the first few times where it appeared. At first it was just a silly thing I threw into a story in Viridian Forest. My friend came to a tree, he hit it or walked up to it or something, and all these Caterpies just rained down upon him. And he was attacked by them and had to run away. This kind of became a theme where there would always be a tree where the characters would approach, a single Caterpie would fall out, and then as soon as they tried to catch the Caterpie or did anything to the tree, this swarm of Caterpie would just rain down and attack them. And it got to a point where they would comment about it, like as they're going up, I would just be like, and then on the top of a grassy hill, you see a tree. And they would just know, they're like, and there's Caterpie in it, aren't there? Or something. They would just make a snide remark about this tree that they're approaching because they already knew exactly what was going to happen. And I'm pretty sure I incorporated the Caterpie tree into every single Pokemon scenario we ever played outside like that. Speaking of Caterpie, I remember there was one scenario where there's an NPC trainer who traveled with the main characters for a while until he was allegedly killed in an accident on the St. Anne, but he later came back, although he was missing an arm at that point because of injuries he sustained during the accident on the ship. I don't remember exactly what happened to the ship. I think got caught in a storm and went down or something like that. Kind of a Titanic situation. But he had a Caterpie that could use Hyper Beam, just because I thought it would be funny and awesome to have a Caterpie that could use Hyper Beam. Also, speaking of Caterpie, Caterpie was a very strong theme in a lot of my scenarios. I also remember a case where one of the player characters caught a giant Caterpie. I don't remember why it was that big, but it was just this massive Caterpie that was taller than he was. And I don't recall anything specific that happened with it. I don't think it ever evolved. It was just this giant Caterpie that was there just for the sake of being there. Also, speaking of Caterpie, but slightly less so, there was a interesting scenario we did once where one of the main characters was, in addition to being a newly budding trainer, he was super into computers and technology and stuff. Not quite to the capacity of Clement, where he was inventing stuff, but he just really knew computers and understood them, and I think he even kept a computer with him at all times, kind of as an alternative to having a Pokédex. There's one point where they happened upon an underground basement of a Team Rocket headquarters, and they found this massive machine that Team Rocket was using to create artificial Pokemon by combining the genetic material of other Pokemon. And I remember them using this computer to create hybrid Pokemon, and then he even copied the program onto his laptop so they could use it later on. Because obviously that's all you would need. You just need the program. You don't need all this expensive equipment to do the cloning process or duplication process or whatever. All you need is the program on a laptop and you can use it all the same. But we were stupid kids, so we had that work. And I just remember this being kind of one of the more interesting things about the scenario was just the fact that because of this place, the main characters were now able to take Pokemon that they had caught already and fuse them. Well, not fuse them together, like they would still keep their original Pokemon, but they could like extract the DNA from them, put them into this program, and then it would create new Pokemon with shared features of them. And the reason this has to do with Caterpie is I remember some of the specific combinations they did. Most notably, I can recall 3 of them, although one of them I'm kind of vague on. 2 of them I remember very distinctly. The first one was combining a Caterpie with a water-type Pokemon. I don't remember which water-type it was. I think it might have been either Squirtle or Magikarp. I think those were the only water-type Pokemon they had at the time, between that character and the other person who was playing. And I remember them making an aquatic Caterpie. It was a little Caterpie about half the size of normal, and its entire body was made of water. And I just remember like the guy who did it picking Caterpie up and then Caterpie just seeping through his fingers, dropping on the floor, and then just reforming itself. And them just thinking that is the most awesome thing. So they copied the program and continued to use it. The other combination I distinctly recall was Beedrill and Charmander. It created a Beedrill that was red instead of yellow, and the needles on its arms became like mouths. Like they were still the needles, still the same shape and everything, but they could open up into jaws that could shoot flamethrowers. There was also one other Pokemon that I believe happened, which was combined from a Squirtle and I want to say Pidgeotto or Pidgey, where it was basically a Squirtle, but its arms and legs were replaced with wings so it could fly. I'm sure other combinations happened as well for the duration that that scenario lasted. We usually didn't finish our scenarios. Usually what would happen is we would start a scenario one day, and then the next day we would just come up with a new one and start from scratch again. So very rarely was a story ever finished. So maybe it was just those 3 that happened if it didn't last long enough, but I feel like there were probably other combinations, but those are the only ones I recall from way back then. One more quick thing I wanted to bring up in regards to the LARPing, though, was maybe the very first Pokemon scenario my friends and I ever did, and it was with one friend, nobody else, and I just remember this funny moment where my friend was wandering through Viridian Forest trying to find and catch Pokemon, and he comes to this cave where he heard this roar, just this frightening, threatening roar come from the cave. So he picks up this baseball bat and slowly starts sneaking into the cave, waiting to just clobber this Pokemon over the head with it to catch it. And then he walks into the cave and he sees a Charizard. And then he just stares at Charizard for a moment and then just drops the bat and bolts out of the cave. And that was just a moment that I just remember as just being hilarious back then because of him getting scared for of the roar. So he grabs a baseball bat to clobber whatever's in the cave and then seeing what's in the cave and just freaking out and running away. Ah, those were the times. Good times. Back when we could just do that kind of stuff without a care. Sort of sticking to the same general topic, next up on my list we've got the tabletop RPG, which never happened, but I had the idea for it. As a kid, I was introduced to Dungeons & Dragons, although it didn't really click for me. There were a lot of things I didn't like about it. I think I wasn't a fan of how especially complicated it was, or certain rules were just annoying. Like, I didn't like the whole having a certain number of spell casts per day and having to like memorize them in advance or whatever, as opposed to just having magic points. There were just a lot of little things about the game that I didn't like. What did come of the game is that it inspired me to make some of my own tabletop RPGs because while I didn't like Dungeons & Dragons specifically because of its rules, I did like the idea that it introduced me to, so I created a ton of my own RPGs throughout the years. Most of them were just generic games, like in medieval settings or sci-fi settings. I made a couple throughout the years based on Dragon Ball Z, and there was even a game that I made that never actually got the chance to be tested. That was kind of like a beat-em-up video game like Streets of Rage or Final Fight, where you would move from screen to screen. You would have various attacks you could use, enemies would show up, and as you progress through the levels, you would be able to learn new attacks from a list of options. One tabletop game in particular that never got finished, it was only ever planned and theorized and whatever, was a Pokemon game. For a time, I had an idea for a Pokemon tabletop RPG that would have some interesting gameplay mechanics. The idea was to try and capture the feel of the anime and the manga more than the video games, while still, of course, being in a turn-based environment. Some of the things I remember from that, first off, character classes. When you create your character, you'd have a specific class for your trainer. Various job classes would be occupations from the anime, like there would be trainer, breeder, watcher, stuff like that. And each job class would have various attributes to make them more efficient at certain things. Like the trainer job would be the best at battles, just in general. They would have quicker reaction times to calling out commands and telling their Pokemon to respond to certain things. They would be able to roll the dice in certain situations to perhaps spot weaknesses or be able to come up with more complex strategies or have their Pokemon respond in more complex ways with easier rolls. Like maybe a trainer might only need to roll an 8, whereas other classes might need to roll a 12 on a D20 to get various bonuses and effects. The breeder wouldn't be as efficient in battles, but would have healthier Pokemon. They would be able to make better food. Their Pokemon would be happier. Their Pokemon would be stronger with less training required, less grinding required. They would just be healthier and more powerful through that rather than just having to constantly fight to get stronger. Stuff like that. So they would just all have their own various advantages. Whether you wanted to focus more on being better in combat or being better at doing other things on your journey that could get you through trials that wouldn't just have to do with fighting. Also, one of the mechanics I came up with that I really wanted to implement was a stamina meter in place of power points and action points, as a lot of games would have and stuff like that. Basically, whenever your Pokemon would perform any action, be it moving, dodging, defending themselves, attacking, everything would use up stamina, and the stamina would recover while the Pokemon was in the Pokeball, kind of like the stamina meter that they gave the trainer in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. So that's how actions would be limited. But also, if a Pokemon's stamina hit 0, they would faint and no longer be able to battle. So you would have to make sure that not only their hit points stay up, because HP would also be a factor, but if they fainted from stamina depletion, then they wouldn't be able to fight anymore in the given battle either. So you couldn't just keep using your strong attacks or your Pokemon would get worn out. So you'd really have to think about what to do and how to make the most of the resources you have available. But aside from those few ideas, the game never really went anywhere. I think I was also going to use the base stats from the video games to determine growth. Not necessarily in the same way, but I think how I was going to do it is you weren't going to gain conventional levels. You would train and your actions would dictate how your stats grow, kind of like in a Monster Rancher sort of style. And I believe how I was going to do it is I was going to use the base stats from the video games as reference, and from there, that would determine how easily certain stats could increase. So the higher the base stat, the more efficiently the Pokemon would be able to raise their certain statistics. So a faster Pokemon would obviously be able to train up their speed easier, but if their strength is low, it would take more effort to build up that stat. And honestly, that's all I really have to say about that. It's not a topic that I can really get very deep into because the game was never finished. I just wanted to bring it up and discuss the few ideas I did have for it before I just scrapped it because I couldn't maintain interest in it. Plus, at that time, my friends and I weren't really playing the games I'd already created very often as is, so it was kind of difficult for me to be inspired enough to create more games when they would probably just not even wind up being played ever anyway, like the aforementioned beat-em-up game I created back then as well. Returning to the topic of the anime for a bit, I'm now going to be discussing my top 3 favorite anime generations. This has no bearing on my opinions of the games and the generations in those, but strictly just the sagas that exist within those generations in the anime. And I'm only going to be doing top 3 because a top 5 feels a little excessive when there's only 7 generations to rate. All that would really just boil down to is which 2 do I like the least? And I think the only one that I would really say I don't like is Generation 3. Because that just felt like a complete waste of time. Especially because that was the very first point in the series where it really just felt like the show wasn't going anywhere. Especially with Ash still struggling to defeat gym leaders. I'm like, really? I understood it in Generation 2 because in Generation 1, a lot of the gym leaders he beat, he didn't really beat. He earned the badges through other means. Then come Generation 2, he was finally strong enough to take on the gym leaders as equals. And then Generation 3 just felt stupid. By that point, he should have surpassed the level of the average gym leader, yet he's still struggling against them just as much as always, and it just felt really dumb. And that alone, in addition to not really caring about a lot of the storylines, not really being too interested in May and Max other than May's early development from going from hating Pokemon to loving them, it just felt really dumb. And then I just was like, whatever. Nothing about it really stood out. Nothing significant happened. Team Aqua and Team Magma were the dumbest villains conceivable, and their goals make them all seem like they're mentally retarded. It's just a train wreck as far as I'm concerned. But moving on to the good, at number 3, we've got Generation 6, the X and Y saga. And this is kind of a weird entry because there's a lot I liked about it, but also a lot I didn't like about it. For example, I didn't really like any of Ash's companions during this storyline, and I think that was the first time that happened because Generation 5 had Silent, who may be my least favorite character in the entire show, but Iris kind of saved it for me except for her incessant nagging to Ash about being a kid, which was an obnoxious character trait, but other than that, I enjoyed having her around. Not to mention that saga also had Snivy, which is my favorite character in the show, and may have somewhat contributed to me being unsure of whether or not I liked Superior or Umbreon more during that period. There was also a lot that I liked about Generation 6, though. I liked some of the Pokemon, I liked some of the relationships between Pokemon and trainers, especially with Team Rocket. The way Jessie captured Pumpkaboo was hilarious, probably the funniest capture in the entire series. Then the feelings that James and Jessie showed towards Inkay and Pumpkaboo were just great. Then there's also Serena, who I didn't really like much as a character as far as her personality, but I really enjoyed her progression as a character throughout the series, and was actually much more invested in her storyline over Ash's, because Ash was just the same repetitive thing. I thought the idea of Ash Greninja was interesting, although I felt it was really stupid that of all the Pokemon that would happen with, it happened with a new one like Greninja, whereas if the possibility of Pokemon becoming stronger through that kind of union is a thing, it should have happened with Pikachu. And so I just felt like that was really, like, it was a cool idea to have something like that happen, and it was cool that Ash had a Pokemon that was that powerful, but it was also annoying because it didn't happen with Pikachu considering the basis for it. So I just really didn't like that, but I also did like it. There was also Team Flare, who is perhaps the dumbest evil organization that Pokemon has ever spawned, but at the same time, the final climactic battle between everybody just coming together to defeat this Armageddon bringer was just an incredible conclusion to the series. So there's just so much good, but so much bad about it that it's kind of hard to really make it sound like I enjoyed it as much as I did, but really it's up there because it's just entertaining. The final battle between Ash and Alon was one of my favorite battles throughout the entire series, probably among my top 3. So, yeah. Can't really think of much else to say about that. I mean, if you've seen it, you can formulate your own opinions about that stuff, and if you haven't, then I'm not going to sit here for an hour giving a full synopsis. Again, I'm not really a movie goer. That kind of applies to TV as well, so it's kind of hard for me to put into words why I like something. Like, I can understand why I like it, but to actually say why I like it is a little bit more complicated, because I just don't know the words or how to express it very efficiently, especially when I'm not actually in an active conversation. It's a lot easier to share an opinion about something when you're receiving feedback in return to what you're saying, but with something like this, I'm just talking to nobody, essentially, at least from my perspective. So it's hard to really keep the conversation going without receiving live feedback. Besides, there's nothing too particularly wrong with that because this video is already looking like it's going to be a lot longer than I wanted it to and expected it to, so speeding things along a little bit is kind of a good thing. Moving on, at number 2, we've got Generation 7, which was such a breath of fresh air that I can't even put into words how refreshing it was for them to finally, after 20 years, do something different. They finally learned that we don't need the same repetitive formula over and over again. And just the fact that Ash isn't on a journey adds so much. You'd think that would take away from it, but my God, it makes everything so much better because of the recurring cast. And that's the key element here, the fact that the episodes matter. Think about it. What's the formula of any given Pokemon episode? The characters meet somebody. This person is having a problem, or maybe the main character is having a problem and this person is able to help them through it. Something happens. Team Rocket, blah, blah, blah. The heroes help this person solve their problem. The heroes move on, having learned a lesson that they'll never reflect upon again. And by the end of the day, you don't even remember who that character was. And you perhaps don't even remember what the episode was. And nothing in the episode has any impact or lasting effect on the show or as you as a viewer. Come Generation 7, and that's all fixed. Because of the recurring cast. Because now Ash isn't on a journey, so he's always around the same people, and there's a lot of those people at that, but the show is still following the same formula of somebody having a problem and it needing to be fixed and the characters growing from it. Becoming better people, overcoming their fears, overcoming problems, maybe catching new Pokemon or having their Pokemon evolve. Only now, all of these storylines are tied to characters that matter. It'll be a Kiawe episode or a Lana episode or a Sophocles episode where they are the ones overcoming these problems, and suddenly this formula that was completely redundant for 20 years now has impact. It matters because the events of the episode have a lasting impact on the development of the characters that you'll continue to see throughout the series. Like, there have been countless Pokemon episodes throughout the series involving a farm or something like it, and a problem occurs with some of the Pokemon on the farm, or a person on the farm has to overcome some sort of thing or learn some sort of lesson to become better, and then it doesn't matter. But now they can take that exact same formula, apply it to Kiawe and his farm, and suddenly it matters. Because you now have a storyline that has a lasting impact because it draws you closer to the character, it helps the character develop, and that character development is relevant. You retain it while watching the show because you're continuing to see that character active in the show, and the events of the episode can have an impact later on, such as Sophocles having to deal with his fear of the dark. He's afraid of the dark, and that's a theme that comes up with him, and there are episodes built around that. But if it were an older episode, it would have just been a case of, oh, there's some person who's afraid of the dark and there's some sort of complication with it, and now he has to overcome it. Ash and his friends help him overcome it. The end. Nothing comes of it. The same could be said about Lily not being able to touch Pokemon. An episode about somebody who can't touch Pokemon. They just solve it. Nothing comes of it by the end of the episode other than the problem was solved, they move on, you never hear of it again. But in this case, it has a lasting impact because one, it lasted several episodes, it came back for a time and she had to get over it again, and you're also reminded of it every time you see Lily with her Vulpix because you're reminded of what the connection between those two characters represents. And the growth that it represents, and all this stuff that happened throughout the series as a result of it, and that led up to it. And this applies to almost every episode in the entire Generation 7 storyline that makes these tired concepts that were once repetitive and redundant and annoying and just making you think, why am I even watching this show if they're just gonna waste my time with this nonsense? Because now that nonsense is no longer nonsense, it's now relevant. And that is why Generation 7 is a storyline in the show that I revere so strongly, because they were able to keep the old formula. They didn't have to change the show so drastically that it's something completely different. Yet at the same time, they finally figured out how to make it work and make you be invested in every single episode rather than just watching the show and then have 90% of the episodes just be like, why do these exist? There was actually a time when I was thinking about at some point going through the entire series. This was actually inspired by Dragon Ball Z Kai, and the idea of that was I thought about coming up with a Kai version of Pokemon going through the entire series and jotting down which episodes matter and which ones you could just skip, not watch at all, and absolutely nothing would change throughout the entire series. It would be the exact same show, just shorter, because you'd be cutting out all the fluff. And Generation 7 doesn't really have that so much because every episode, or almost every episode, has a story that you care about because it involves characters that you care about, not just some throwaway nobody that you're not even going to remember the face or the name of by the end of the day. They also replaced Electro Ball, which I loved, because Electro Ball added nothing to Pikachu's arsenal. It seemed to exist only for the sole purpose of getting rid of Volt Tackle, which is one of the dumbest things the show has ever done, because not only was it Ash's trump card, but it was also Pikachu's signature move. Signature move. That would be like Lena Inverse suddenly no longer being able to use the Dragon Slave. Or Goku no longer being able to use Kamehameha. Or heck, Master Roshi no longer being able to use Kamehameha for that matter. The guy who created the technique no longer being able to use it. And not only that, but they replaced it with something that was just basically other Thunderbolt. Yeah, Electro Ball and Thunderbolt are completely different in the video games, but in the cartoon, they just kind of treated them almost interchangeably. And so it was just, replacing Electro Ball with Electro Web was just the best thing that could have happened to Pikachu's arsenal ever since he learned that, because now he has a move that has so much more applications than just dealing damage. And that makes Pikachu's capabilities much more interesting. Then there's also the little things like I really enjoyed Litten's story with Stoutland. Beware is obnoxious as hell. I wish they would just get rid of that, especially because it tends to show up at the worst possible times and just ruin Team Rocket's plans when they don't need to be ruined. And also Team Rocket finally defeated Ash in a battle, which was nice. I mean, Beware showed up because it's a piece of shit, but I don't know. I feel like Beware is definitely the weakest link, especially because I feel like it's there for comedy, but there's nothing funny about it. It's just a nuisance. And not a nuisance in a good way, so I could do without Beware. But other than that, the Sun and Moon anime is great. At least once you get used to the new animation style, because I wasn't a fan of how young they made Ash look. I know Ash doesn't technically age throughout the show, but I liked how the animation kind of aged him. If you look from the generation to generation, I feel like he gradually looks like he's getting older, even though he's not. But then Generation 7 just made him look super young, and I get that they maybe wanted to make him look more like a 10-year-old, especially because in like Generation 6, I would say he looked more as if he were about 13 or 14 years old. But I didn't like that because I always enjoyed how, despite him not really aging much, they kind of showed that he was sort of aging or maturing through his character design into animation. At least that's how I always felt. But then the Sun and Moon animation just completely threw that out the window. But once you get used to it, you watch it a few episodes, you stop caring, and then it just stops clicking as a problem. And at number 1, we have Generation 4, the Diamond Pearl story arc. And it may seem kind of weird that this is at number 1 instead of Generation 7, because I don't think I really have a whole lot to talk about with this one by comparison. But despite that, it's definitely my favorite for one major reason, and that is Ash's growth. Especially after Generation 3 just feeling like a complete waste of time, aside from the fact that it introduced Pokemon contests, which, boring as hell as they are in the video games, I actually sometimes enjoyed watching those more than standard battles when it came to watching the show. But the main thing here is Ash's growth. The significance in which he grew from the start of Generation 4 to the end was just so... what's the word I want? Not rewarding, but like fulfilling to see, I guess. It was just nice to finally see him making progress, real progress, especially considering the fact that he was still fighting gym leaders and still struggling with them. So it just made it feel like he wasn't making progress, that he was just in a rut. And so seeing such a strong emphasis on his progress was enjoyable to watch. It made it just a really good show to watch, especially when you start incorporating things like how he mimicked Don's technique of spinning in the air to be able to like dodge attacks mid-jump or whatever, and then he expanded upon that to such insane degrees that he was able to create his own technique, which then Paul in turn mimicked, and even Dawn copied it later on when she came back during Generation 5. And I feel like that's all I really have to say. The rivalry between Ash and Paul was interesting because they both had the same number of experiences throughout their journeys, except Paul was just better. The storyline with Chimchar was kind of interesting, the whole blind rage thing and having to overcome that. But it was just Ash's growth, and that alone just made it so enjoyable, actually seeing Ash making progress, and it made Generation 5 piss me off, but that's a whole other topic that we're not going to be discussing today. But yeah, I feel like that's all I really had to say. It was just enjoyable. I just... bleh. I feel like an idiot saying that I liked Generation 4 more than Generation 7 when I had so much more to say about Gen 7. Part of that could, though, also be that it's fresher in my mind since it's still currently going. In the English dub, they just got to the Pokemon League as of my recording this. So, I still have to see how that's gonna go. I would respect there not being any spoilers involving that in the comments because I've also been trying to avoid spoilers involving that kind of stuff. Also, my favorite battle in the entire series was the final one between Ash and Paul at the very end. The battle with Tobias was epic, despite the fact that Ash lost, but just the fact that he was able to not only defeat Darkrai, but also fight Latios to a draw after they had specified that Tobias had gotten through every gym and the entire Pokemon League using only Darkrai, made that quite the battle for the ages. And yeah, I just can't really think of anything to really add to it, honestly. It's just my favorite because of Ash's growth and how much more significant it felt compared to everything up until that point in regards to progressing Ash as a trainer, and finally, it felt like he was finally pushing to become a Pokemon Master. Up until that point, he was just kind of going through the motions. It felt like he was working hard, but he wasn't really making any significant pushes, and this is when he finally did, and it finally felt like the show was going somewhere for the first time in ages, and I just admired it for that until they threw it all in the trash. So there you have it, my 3 favorite anime generations. 6, then 7, then 4. And there was my summary as to why I enjoyed each one as much as I did. Moving on to topic number 7. Another countdown, but now we're going on to the video games as I wanted to quickly go over my top 5 favorite Pokemon games. Now, this is kind of a weird topic because I feel like Pokemon has a weird dynamic with its games. What I mean by that is, it has a tendency to make older games obsolete. In a lot of video game franchises, I feel as though when they make a new game, they apply old mechanics, they apply new mechanics, they try and do something to make it stand out from the rest, but they don't inherently just improve what's already there. They just take the ideas and do something different with them, whereas Pokemon as a franchise is always just striving to do more, striving to be better, striving to add more stuff to make a more expansive experience than it was last time, and as a result, I feel as though the games oftentimes become obsolete. Because of Pokemon Gold and Silver, I feel no compulsion to ever want to play Red and Blue again because Gold and Silver is just the same exact game, but better. Better mechanics, more stuff, more Pokemon, more moves, just more everything. It's just the same exact game, only it's bigger and better. Ruby and Sapphire come out. I feel that same way now about Gold and Silver. Diamond and Pearl come out. I now feel that way about Ruby and Sapphire. No desire whatsoever to go back because it's just the exact same game, but inferior in every way, unless you care that much about the storyline. But really, the Pokemon games storylines are so similar that aspect is almost inconsequential as far as judging the games in most cases. Except there are some cases where I feel like later storylines are worse and I would judge them based on that. But it doesn't change the fact that I still would have no compulsion to go back to the older games because they would just be boring now that the newer ones have just been the better that. Other franchises, though, don't really do that. Like Final Fantasy. Just because I like Final Fantasy VI more than Final Fantasy V doesn't mean that Final Fantasy V is obsolete because they're both completely different games. Aside from the fact that they have the active time battle system and a lot of the spells and monsters have the same names, but even those spells will be different. Haste in one Final Fantasy game may be a completely different spell than Haste in another one, but in Pokemon, Tackle is always Tackle. It's the same exact move in every single game. Every Pokemon is the same exact Pokemon in every game. Charmander in one game is Charmander in another game. It's just now this other game is that but more. And it's just a better game. It's a more polished experience. It's a better experience. There's more to it. There's new Pokemon. There's more you can do in it. There's more you can experience in it. I'm sure a lot of people don't share this feeling, but it's just how I feel. And it's also why Pokemon is only number 3 as far as my favorite video game franchises instead of number 2. I put number 2 as Metroid because it's not as tainted with games that are either just bad to begin with or it's not tainted with games that are obsolete because of future installments. I'm sure that's an opinion that a lot of people don't agree with, but just keep that in mind. If that weren't the case, my top 5 games on this list would just be 5 core series Pokemon games. But because the later core series games keep making the older ones obsolete, that's not the case. So, if not for that, I wouldn't even bother having this as one of the topics, honestly, because I wouldn't have anything to talk about. It would just be the core series games, and that would be that. There wouldn't be any variety to the list, so I would have come up with a different thing to talk about. So just keep that in mind while I'm doing this, that's a factor in how the games are rated for me. Because once the next generation core games come out, the previous ones are veritable garbage because of how they just take the same idea and don't do anything new with it other than just make it better while not removing anything or changing anything that would make me feel like, you know what, I feel like playing one of the old ones instead because I liked the mechanics more, or there was a quirk about the battle system that I enjoyed more, or maybe because I want to use these characters instead when it's all the same things anyway. From game to game, just one has more in it. So let's go through the list. Starting at number 5, we've got Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon. And with this, I just want to give a quick shout out to the Explorers games for having a much better storyline. But that's just in regards to the plot because Super did everything else with its story better. The actual plot of the Explorers games is much better, but one of the things I loved most about Super Mystery Dungeon is the relationship between yourself and your partner, and not just because of what it becomes, but how it's developed. In every previous Mystery Dungeon game, it's just, hello, complete stranger, we're best friends now. Let's form a team and do stuff. There's no reason behind it. It's just, it happens because it has to happen. In Super Mystery Dungeon, there's so much more build-up, so much more development. You're like 10 to 15 hours into the game before you even form an expedition team with your partner. And that just makes everything so much more meaningful and so much more impactful and so much more relevant as opposed to the other games where it's just, we're friends now. Who are you? Who cares? We're friends now because the plot needs us to be. So that's a big part of it right there. Plus also the fact that they just did so many great things with the gameplay. They fixed a lot of the stuff that sucked about Gates to Infinity while expanding upon the stuff that was good about it. And the gameplay in it is way more polished than some of the older entries in the Mystery Dungeon series. And it's just an enjoyable experience. I like the gameplay and the battle system of exploring a dungeon in a sort of pseudo real-time thing, but it's also turn-based. And because turn-based RPGs are my favorite video game genre, that's much more interesting to me than actually exploring in real time. But because of how the battle system works, it almost feels real time with how it's laid out, even though it's not. Number 4 on this list is Pokemon Puzzle League, which is also my favorite block-based puzzle game, period. I love how high octane it is. It's just a crazy good time. It's kind of hard to explain. It just really gets you pumped and your adrenaline just starts pumping. Your hands start sweating. You just really get into it and you invest 100% concentration into every second of every match. It's a blast to play with friends. I mean, what can really be said about that kind of game? It's a block-based puzzle game like Tetris or Columns or Dosun Stone Battle. It takes the feeling you get from that kind of game, the kind of rush it gives you, the kind of concentration it gives you, the kind of just urgency to match the blocks before you get taken out, and applies it in the way that just thrills me the most. And having the Pokemon characters is a nice plus, but that's not particularly relevant to the game itself. Although it was a game that I considered as one of the 2 most advanced games on the N64. That and Super Smash Bros. I considered those the absolute pinnacle of technological advancement on the N64 for various reasons. Pokemon Puzzle League was on that list because it had cinematics, and I never saw another N64 game that had cinematics in my life. And Super Smash Bros. Was on that list because it was the only N64 game I ever experienced where you could plug a controller in after the console was turned on and the system would recognize the controller. Which was a really stupidly weird feature on the N64, where if you plugged a controller in, but the system was on, it wouldn't know that the controller was plugged in. You would have to turn the system off, then turn it back on, or just plug the controller in while the system was off, or it wouldn't recognize the controller. No other system I've ever experienced was like that, so why was the N64 built in such a stupid way? Especially because it had such a strong focus on multiplayer that obviously controllers are going to be going in and out rather frequently. Seems kind of counterintuitive, but it was a thing and Smash Bros. Fixed it. Now, number 3 on this list is a little bit of a contradiction to what I was just saying about Pokemon games becoming obsolete, but as with any rule, there's exceptions. And in this case, number 3 is Pokemon Black and White. If you're watching this video, I don't really need to get into what there is to like about the core series Pokemon games, because if you're into Pokemon video games, chances are those are the ones you're into more than any others. So I don't really feel like I need to get into too much detail with that. I'm just gonna say that the reason Black and White to me is an exception is because of the story. And I know the story I said before is real repetitive in the games, but this game takes that same formula and does things that just make it feel so much like a real RPG. Pokemon games don't feel like real RPGs to me because there's no like significant interaction with other characters other than your rival. There's no, it's hard to say, but most Pokemon games lack a lot of the qualities that a lot of other RPGs have, and I feel like Black and White fixed that, such as having the villain be the final boss, instead of somebody who isn't a villain, just somebody you have to defeat to complete your journey. Having Ghetsis as the final boss instead of just the champion made the whole thing with Team Plasma and the whole game as a whole feel so much more significant because your final battle is an actual climax, not just fighting the champion and whatever. There's no consequences. Granted, there's no consequences in Pokemon anyway because you just lose money and then go back, but it felt like an actual climactic battle that you needed to win or else, whereas other games, it doesn't have that same sort of impact. Also, the gym leaders. The gym leaders did stuff, and I feel like that's something gym leaders should do. I've always felt like gym leaders should have a responsibility when the region is being threatened, when the people in Pokemon are being threatened by some powerful force. You would think the gym leaders, the allegedly strongest and most upholding trainers in the region, would do something about it. And in Black and White, they did. They actually contributed. You actually saw them throughout your journey trying to do this and that, trying to deal with Team Plasma. At the very end, all the gym leaders actually show up to help you in the final dungeon. And so it feels like they matter as characters. And that just left such a big impact compared to other Pokemon games where everything just depends on this random 10-year-old for no reason other than he's the main character. Number 2 on this list is Pokken Tournament DX, which is also probably my favorite fighting game. So that's 2 Pokemon games that hold the number 1 spot for me as far as the genre they belong to goes. What can I say about it other than it's a dream come true? Ever since I first saw Pokemon Coliseum and the idea of Pokemon having advanced graphics and being on a console and everything goes, I always wanted to see... Well, for starters, I always wanted to see a Pokemon RPG on a console instead of a handheld, which we're finally getting. I discussed this already in my Pokken video, which you can go ahead and watch that if you want to see the game and see a bit more about why I like it. I feel like you can just go ahead and watch that. I don't really need to get into too much detail about the game itself. But one thing I did bring up in that video was growing up, there were always 3 genres of video games that I always wanted to see Pokemon have games for, and one of those was fighting games. I always wanted a Pokemon fighting game because I felt like they could very well translate the idea, particularly from the anime, into a fighting game. Pokken Tournament didn't do that perfectly, but they did a good enough job that it's an exceptionally enjoyable experience. And at number 1, we have Pokemon Sun and Moon because my favorite Pokemon game at any given point is always the latest core series game. Again, because those are just the best Pokemon games out there, in my opinion, and it's always the newest one because of all the stuff I explained earlier. Although I haven't played Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon because I wasn't interested. It was at a point where I was just like, I don't want to bother with a special edition version of the exact same game I just played, especially because I feel as though they moved on to releasing the special edition quicker than usual. So I just wasn't interested. I was just like, whatever, I'm just gonna pass on this. I think I was too busy with other stuff at the time and I just wasn't interested in experiencing the same game again. Black and White did it right by having an actual sequel, and X and Y just didn't even bother with the special edition. So before that, the last special edition was Pokemon Platinum, which I played, but back then I was also at a completely different point in my life because of how many years ago that was. So with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, I just didn't feel like I had the time or the interest to bother. So I didn't. Looking at my notes, I forgot to mention another thing I really liked about Pokemon Super Mystery Dungeon was the final boss and how it's not a Pokemon. For so many years, I wanted bosses that weren't Pokemon in Pokemon games. I was always fascinated by Team Rocket's giant robots and just other possibilities that I wanted stuff like that. I wanted bosses in games that weren't just fighting a Pokemon. If you're fighting someone like a boss or a gym leader or something, they send out Pokemon, it's no different from any other battle in the entire game, aside from them maybe being slightly higher level or having 1 or 2 more Pokemon than the average trainers. It's just the exact same thing over and 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 over again, even more repetitive than that sentence I just uttered. So the final boss in Super Mystery Dungeon not being a Pokemon was the greatest thing the game could have given me, and I want to see more of that. I want to see bosses that are other things. Maybe have a villain with a giant robot that you have to fight, like Team Rocket's robots in the anime, or just something that makes the bosses more than just slightly higher leveled what you've already been fighting for the last 30 hours or the last 20 years, however you want to look at it. So the final topic I have for you guys today is shiny Pokemon. I'm sure you all know what shiny Pokemon are, although back when I was a kid, I just called them different colored Pokemon. I didn't know they had an official name. I don't even know if that official name existed yet when they were first introduced. I've caught a decent number throughout the years. I've had a Slackoth, a Metatite, a Cinccino, a Pidgeotto. I've had a decent number of shinies throughout the years. I've kept most of them, aside from some from Gold and Silver that I obviously couldn't transfer up to Ruby and Sapphire, but I do have one dating all the way back to Ruby and Sapphire in my Sun and Moon game that I've just been trading up over and over again as the generations advanced so I could hold on to them. But there are two specific shiny Pokemon stories I wanted to share. Ones that were just... One was frightening, and the other is just such a big coincidence that I still can't wrap my head around it to this day, and it actually led me to believe that a particular shiny encounter was scripted for a while. And I'm not talking about the red Gyarados, although it was in that game. Let's get to the scary one, because I really want to save the big what the blah 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 for last. Shiny Geodude. This happened in Fire Red. I was at Victory Road, I believe, or somewhere near the end, and I ran into a wild Geodude that was shiny. For those of you who know Geodude, you can understand why this might have been a frightening experience. I just remember my heart racing, my palms sweating, I'm attacking the thing, trying to weaken it, waiting to get it down low enough so I can throw that Pokeball, and the whole time, in my head, on an infinite loop, was don't you self-destruct, don't you self-destruct, don't you self-destruct. The entire battle from start to finish. I was just freaking out that at any moment, this shiny Geodude could use self-destruct, and I really wanted a shiny Geodude. As I said before, Golem used to be my favorite Pokemon, so it would be awesome to be able to have a shiny one at some point. Also, because I think it was the very first time where I ever encountered a shiny Pokemon that I actually liked. Usually when I encountered a shiny Pokemon, it would be something like Slackoth or Metatite or some stupid Pokemon I didn't care about. So it was just sort of a bittersweet thing whenever I would find a shiny Pokemon. It's like, sweet, a shiny Pokemon. I don't care that it's that thing, but I'll catch it. Speaking of that, though, I'm actually reminded of another interesting instance involving shiny Pokemon that was with a friend. And it was just a kind of funny thing. We just got back from him picking up Pokemon Black or White, one of them, and he was playing the game. Not an hour into the game, he runs into a shiny Riolu. But that's not the funny thing about it. The funny thing about it was he had never encountered a shiny Pokemon before, and he was so caught off guard by it that when he saw the thing, he asked me and the other friend who was there. He's just playing his game, and then he's just like, why is this Riolu yellow? And both me and the other friend just looked at each other like, holy shit, it's a shiny Riolu. And the person who was playing the game, it just didn't register in his head right away that that's what it was, because in all those years, he'd never encountered a shiny before. But on to the crazy thing, the grand finale of this video that is going to be longer than I expected. And this recording is definitely taking longer. I'm worn out at this point and my throat's starting to hurt from all this talking. And this last story involves my very first ever shiny Pokemon. And it was a Paris. I was playing Pokemon Silver, and I went to the forest. I can't remember what the forest in that game was off the top of my head, but I'm going through the forest. I don't think it was the very first random battle I found in the place, but it was the very first Paris I encountered, and it was shiny. I didn't think that it looked weird at the time because this was Pokemon Gold and Silver colors we're talking about. In fact, I don't even think I had... Did I? Yeah, I think I had a Game Boy Color at that time. I can't remember 100%, but I'm pretty sure I did. But I just encountered this Paris and I caught it. I didn't think anything of it. It didn't register at the time that it was anything special because I didn't know what shiny Pokemon were. I didn't know they existed. I didn't know how rare they were. I just knew that it was a weird looking Paris that had this little sparkle go around it. So the very first Paris in the game I ever encountered was a shiny Paris. But that's not the crazy thing about this story. The crazy thing about this story is my friend at the time who was playing the game had the exact same experience. He went to that forest, very first Paris he encountered in the forest in a random battle was a shiny Paris. both of us, two people who knew each other personally, who were friends at time in school and were playing the games at the same time and talking about it, both encountered the same first shiny Pokemon in the same place under the same exact conditions. Same dungeon, same games, same Pokemon. For both of us, it was the first one we encountered in that forest. We both had the exact same first shiny Pokemon experience. And so for a while, I literally thought that shiny Paris was a scripted thing. And to this day, it still just blows my mind that a coincidence like that could happen. So there you have it. That was this video. I have no idea what's going on in the game you're watching at present, assuming you're actually watching the footage and not just listening to this while doing something else. I hope you enjoyed what I've been rambling on about for a while. I hope you enjoy what you've been seeing on the screen if you're paying attention to that. And if you guys have any Pokemon stories that may be similar to these, perhaps on the same topics, maybe you'd like to share some of your favorite Pokemon, some of your favorite movies, perhaps some other interesting stories involving Pokemon that you've had over the years, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear them and even perhaps engage in those conversations myself if I get the chance. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and also let me know if you'd like me to do other videos like this. It was way more time consuming than I expected it to be, but considering it'll also be far less edited than other videos, it'll still definitely be quicker. It's the sort of thing I could certainly dish out more frequently and at a quicker pace than the stuff I'm currently working on. So let me know if you'd like to see more videos like this. Maybe I could find other games that I could play while talking about similar stories, like maybe a Dragon Ball Z game or something based on a licensed something. With that, I'll see you next time.